January 1939, in the heart of Barcelona, 4 p.m. The city was a jagged landscape of broken glass and starving shadows, a place where the air tasted of corduroy dust and cold ash. For Juan Pujol García, this was not just the of a city, but the of a world. He stood in the wreckage of a republic that had failed him, having spent years dodging bullets and ideologies that he found equally repulsive. He had been a reluctant soldier, a man who had seen the worst of humanity from both the communist and fascist lines, and he had come to a singular, burning conclusion. He hated the extremists who had turned his homeland into a slaughterhouse. As the sun dipped behind the jagged horizon of the Catalan hills, Pujol knew that simply surviving was no longer enough. He felt a moral obligation to act, but he was a man with no army, no influence, and no obvious path to power. He was a failed poultry farmer and a mediocre hotel manager, yet in the silence of that January afternoon, the seeds of the greatest deception in military history were beginning to take root in his mind. By the time the global conflict escalated into the Second World War, Pujol was living in Madrid. At 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in early 1941, he adjusted his tie and walked toward the British embassy with a heart full of desperate conviction. He believed the British were the only hope for a free Europe, and he wanted to offer them his life. He was ushered into a small, sterile office where he met with British intelligence officers. He spoke with passion, offering to go to Germany to infiltrate the Nazi machine and to act as a mole for the Allied cause. He expected a handshake, a secret code, and a mission. Instead, he was met with a wall of polite British indifference. To the men in the embassy, Pujol looked like a dreamer, or perhaps a nuisance. He lacked the pedigree, the training, and the cold professionalism they expected from an operative. They thanked him for his time and showed him the door, telling him in no uncertain terms that they had no use for a volunteer with no experience. He returned to the embassy several times, each attempt more desperate than the last. At 1 p.m. during his final visit, the rejection was blunt. He was told to stop coming back. For most men, this would have been the story. They would have returned to their quiet lives and waited for the war to pass them by. But Juan Pujol García was not like most men. He possessed a psychological resilience that bordered on the obsessive. He realized that if the British would not take him as he was, he would have to become someone else. He understood that the world of intelligence was not built on truth, but on the appearance of truth. If the British wouldn't trust a loyal Spaniard, perhaps they would eventually trust a fanatical Nazi. He decided to flip the script. He would go to the German Abwehr, the military intelligence service of the Third Reich, and offer to spy for them against Britain. He would build a reputation as a master agent for the Nazis, and once he had their total confidence, he would force the British to acknowledge him. It was a plan born of equal parts brilliance and madness. He was a man with no contacts in London, no knowledge of the English language, and no way to actually get to the United Kingdom. Yet he intended to convince the most paranoid regime on earth that he was their man in London. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, as he sat in a quiet cafe reflecting on his rejection, Pujol began to map out a fictional world. He realized that the greatest weapon in his arsenal was not a gun or a radio, but the human imagination. He would not just tell lies. He would build a universe of lies so dense and detailed that the truth would become irrelevant. This early disillusionment was the catalyst for a transformation that would change the course of the war. He was a man who had been rejected by the side he loved, only to realize that his greatest service would come from preaching to serve the side he hated. It was a poignant irony that would define his legacy. Pujol proved that the most dangerous man in a war of giants is often the one everyone ignores, the one who is told he has nothing to offer. His journey reminds us that history is not just shaped by generals and kings, but by the stubborn, invisible individuals who refuse to take no for an answer, turning their personal disillusionment into a masterclass of psychological warfare. This was the moment the leg of Garbo was born, not in a hall of heroes, but in the quiet, bitter sting of being told he wasn't good enough. July 1941, in the bustling neutral port of Lisbon, a man with no formal training in espionage sat in a small hotel room, preparing to pull off one of the greatest bluffs in human history. Juan Pujol García had been rejected by the British authorities, but he was not a man who accepted a closed door. He realized that to be accepted by the Allies, he first had to become indispensable to the Axis. He had convinced the German military intelligence, the Abwehr, that he was a fanatical Spanish official with frequent access to London. They had given him invisible ink, a codebook, and the code name Alaric. They believed he was currently embedded in the heart of the British capital. In reality, Pujol was nearly 1,000 miles away in Portugal, hunched over a desk with nothing but a map of England, a Portuguese travel guide to the British Isles, and a collection of outdated magazines. He was a freelance deceiver, a ghost in the machinery of global conflict. He knew that for his lie to survive, it needed more than just his own voice. It needed a chorus. From that quiet room in Lisbon, Pujol began to breathe life into a phantom army of informants. He didn't just write reports. He wrote characters. He informed his German handlers that he had successfully recruited a travel agent in London who was willing to monitor troop movements. A few weeks later, he added a Swiss businessman and a disgruntled Gibraltarian waiter to his payroll. To the Abwehr, these were real human beings with real eyes on the ground. To Pujol, they were the cast of a grand play where he was the only actor. His days were spent in a fever of creative labor. At 10 a.m., he would scour the local libraries for any scrap of information about British infrastructure. By 2 p.m., he would be synthesizing these facts into urgent intelligence reports. He had to be careful. He had never actually stepped foot in England. He made errors that should have been fatal. In one report, he claimed that citizens in Glasgow were willing to do anything for a litre of wine, completely unaware of the Scottish cultural preference for beer and whiskey. In another, he described the rail systems using terms that didn't exist in the British lexicon. Yet his tone was so authoritative and his dedication so seemingly absolute that the Germans never questioned him. They wanted to believe they had a master spy in London so badly that they ignored the cracks in his stories. By the time the sun set at 8:15 p.m. over the Tagus River, Pujol would often be exhausted by the mental gymnastics required to keep his fictitious network consistent. He had to remember which fake agent lived in which fake apartment and what specific lies he had told about their backgrounds. He was creating a sub-reality, a shadow world that the Abwehr began to rely on for their strategic planning. He was essentially writing a novel in real time, where the stakes were the lives of thousands and the fate of the European continent. He was no longer just Juan Pujol García. He was the architect of a grand illusion. The brilliance of his freelance period in Lisbon was not just in the lies he told, but in the psychological profile he built for himself. He made himself appear slightly temperamental and demanding, often complaining to his handlers about the difficulty of his work or the lack of funds. This made him human. It made him believable. He was building a foundation of credibility that would eventually allow him to direct the course of the entire war. He was a man who had turned his invisibility into a weapon, proving that in the theater of war, the most powerful person is often the one who isn't even in the room. This period of isolation and invention serves as a profound testament to the power of the individual will. Pujol was a man who had been told he was of no use, yet he sat in a foreign city and manipulated the high command of a global superpower using nothing but his imagination. It reminds us that the most significant battles are often fought in the quietest corners, and that history is frequently steered by those who possess the audacity to invent their own destiny. He was a reminder that even when the world is engulfed in flames, a single person with enough conviction can create a fire of their own, one that burns with the light of truth or the heat of a perfectly crafted lie. His legacy is not found in the medals he would later receive, but in the sheer, staggering bravery of a man who decided that if he could not join the fight, he would simply invent a version of it that he could win. April 24, 1942, London. The man known as Juan Pujol García finally stepped onto British soil, carrying nothing but a suitcase of lies and the ambition to rewrite the history of the war. After months of operating as a self-made double agent from the remote safety of Lisbon, where he had convinced the Germans he was spying from within England, using only a map and a guide to the British railway system, the British intelligence services finally realized that this eccentric Spaniard was either a lunatic or a genius. They decided he was the latter. He was assigned a handler, Thomas Harris, a man who shared Pujol's flair for the dramatic and his intricate understanding of human nature. Together, they would transform a solitary deception into Operation Garbo, the most successful and complex misinformation campaign in the history of espionage. The British gave him codename Garbo because they considered him the greatest actor in the world. But an actor needs a cast, and Pujol's stage was too large for a solo performance. To satisfy the German High Command's appetite for intelligence, Garbo began to populate the British Isles with a fictional army of sub-agents. He didn't just invent names. He invented souls. There was Agent 3, a wealthy Venezuelan living in Glasgow, with a deep-seated hatred for the British Empire. There was Agent 4, a disgruntled Gibraltarian waiter who supposedly worked in an underground canteen in the heart of London. There was even a Welsh nationalist who led a group of saboteurs in the valley of the River Dee. By the time the operation reached its peak, Garbo had created 27 distinct imaginary personalities, each with their own backstories, motivations, and specific access to military secrets. By 3 p.m. on most afternoons, Harris and Pujol would sit in a small, nondescript office, meticulously drafting hundreds of letters and radio messages. They were not just writing intelligence reports. They were writing a serialized novel, where the stakes were the lives of millions. They had to account for the smallest details. If an imaginary agent was supposed to be in Liverpool, they had to ensure his reports mentioned the specific weather patterns of the Northwest. If an agent was sick, Garbo would messages explaining the delay in reporting, even going so far as to kill off one of his fictional spies and having his widow write a letter to the Germans asking for the pension her husband had been promised. The Germans, incredibly, sent the money. This was the strategy of noise. By flooding the Abwehr, the German military intelligence, with a constant stream of information, Garbo made himself indispensable. Most of the information was true but useless. Details about troop movements that had already happened, or descriptions of industrial centers that were common knowledge. This built an ironclad foundation of credibility. When Garbo spoke, the Germans listened with religious devotion. They were so overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data coming from Garbo's network that they stopped looking for other sources. He became their primary eyes and ears in Britain, effectively blinding them to the reality of the Allied preparations for the invasion of Europe. The genius of the 27 agents was that they allowed Garbo to be everywhere at once. He could report on the mythical 1st U.S. Army Group in Kent, while simultaneously tracking fictional convoys in the Irish Sea. This created a holographic image of British military strength that simply did not exist. The German intelligence officers in Berlin were so proud of their master spy that they overlooked the inconsistencies, far too invested in the success of their V-man to doubt his word. Every evening at 9 p.m., the radio transmitters in London would hum with the secrets of a ghost army, and in Berlin, the officers would lean in, unaware that they were being fed a diet of pure imagination. The legacy of this grand illusion is found in the silence of the guns on the beaches of Normandy that were never fired because German reinforcements were waiting for an invasion that Garbo had promised would happen elsewhere. It is a testament to the fact that in the theater of war, the most powerful weapon is not always the one that explodes, but the one that persuades. Pujol and Harris proved that the human mind is the ultimate battlefield. They didn't just hide the truth. They replaced it with a lie so vibrant and so meticulously detailed that the truth became irrelevant. In the The story of the 27 imaginary agents reminds us that history is often shaped by the shadows we choose to believe in. Juan Pujol García lived a life of total fabrication to preserve the possibility of a world where the truth could once again exist. He walked the tightrope between hero and fraud, knowing that a single slip would mean his death and the potential defeat of the Allied cause. His fire did not burn with the raw destruction of artillery, but with the steady, flickering light of a story well told, proving that sometimes the most enduring victories are won by those who have the courage to invent the world they need to see. June 6, 1944, in a nondescript apartment in the heart of London, Juan Pujol García sat before a radio transmitter, his fingers poised to deliver the most calculated deception in the history of warfare. For years, he had been building a castle made of glass, a network of 27 imaginary spies that existed only in his mind and on the secret reports he sent to Berlin. He had convinced the German High Command that he was their greatest asset in Britain, a man with his finger on the pulse of the Allied war machine. Now, as the largest invasion fleet in history began to churn the waters of the English Channel, the man known as Garbo had to perform his final, most dangerous act. The deception was called Operation Fortitude, and its objective was as simple as it was impossible. Pujol had to convince Adolf Hitler that the landings at Normandy were nothing more than a giant distraction. He needed the Germans to believe that the real blow, the massive, crushing blow, would fall miles to the north at the Pas de Calais. To do this, he had conjured a phantom army out of thin air. He spoke to his German handlers of the 1st United States Army Group, a force of nearly 1 million men under the command of General George S. Patton. He described their movements, their insignia, and their growing impatience to cross the narrowest part of the sea. But as the clocks in London struck 3 a.m., the tension in the room was suffocating. MI5 had orchestrated a brilliant, risky gambit. Garbo was instructed to ess a message to Madrid at this exact hour, warning the Germans that a fleet was actually sailing toward Normandy. It was a move designed to cement his credibility. If he warned them and the invasion happened, he would be a hero in Berlin. If the message was received too late to stop the landings, the Allies would lose nothing. In a twist of fate that almost ruined everything, the German operator in Madrid had gone to sleep and didn't check the frequency. Garbo hammered at the key, but there was no response. It wasn't until 8 a.m. that the connection was finally made, long after the first Allied soldiers had begun dying on the beaches of France. Pujol turned this failure into a weapon. He sent a blistering, angry message to his handlers, accusing them of negligence and claiming that his agents had risked their lives to ess a warning that was ignored. The Germans, feeling guilty for their lapse, became even more desperate to listen to him. At 12:15 p.m., while the chaos of D-Day was at its peak, Garbo sent his masterstroke. He told Berlin that although the Normandy landings were significant, they were merely a feint designed to draw German reserves away from the Pas de Calais. This lie was so meticulously constructed and so perfectly aligned with Hitler's own fears that it was accepted as absolute truth. For weeks after D-Day, as the Allies struggled to break out of the hedgerows, Hitler held the powerful 15th Army in reserve at Calais. He was waiting for Patton and his phantom divisions, convinced by a quiet Spaniard in a London apartment that the real war had not yet begun. Because of this hesitation, the German reinforcements that could have crushed the Normandy bridgehead never arrived. The success of the hoax was so total that in late July, the German government awarded Juan Pujol the Iron Cross for his exceptional service. Only a few months later, King George VI privately awarded him the Member of the Order of the British Empire. He remains perhaps the only person to be decorated by both sides during the conflict, a testament to a man who lived a life entirely composed of shadows. When the war ended, the leg of Garbo didn't fade into the sunlight. It disappeared into the mist. Fearing retribution from remnants of the Nazis, Pujol faked his own death from malaria in Angola in 1948. For decades, the world believed the greatest spy of the war was dead. It wasn't until 1984 that a historian tracked him down in Venezuela, where he was living as a humble bookstore owner and teacher, his neighbors having no idea that the elderly man next door had once held the fate of Western civilization in his hands. Juan Pujol García proved that the human mind is the most formidable battlefield of all. He didn't win the war with steel, but with the profound understanding that people will always believe the lie that confirms their own expectations. He was a man who became a ghost to save a world he loved, proving that sometimes the most enduring legacy is not a monument of stone, but the quiet, invisible influence of a man who knew when to speak and when to disappear. He walked through the fires of the 20th century without ever leaving a footprint, a reminder that the truth is often protected by a bodyguard of lies, and that the greatest victories are won by those who have the courage to remain unknown. July 29, 1944, in a hidden safe house on the outskirts of London, a radio operator transcribed a message that would represent the pinnacle of a double agent's career. The transmission came directly from the German High Command in Berlin, carrying the personal authorization of Adolf Hitler. It informed Juan Pujol García, known to the Abwehr as Arabelle, that he had been awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. For the German leadership, this was a gesture of profound gratitude toward the man they believed had saved their army from a second, larger invasion at the Pas de Calais. For Pujol and his British handlers at MI5, it was the ultimate punchline to the greatest practical joke ever played in the theater of war. The man who had single-handedly ensured the success of D-Day by feeding the Nazis a diet of fictional spies and phantom armies was now a decorated hero of the Third Reich. The irony deepened only a few months later. On a cold morning in December 1944, Pujol was summoned to a far more private engagement. In a ceremony kept strictly off the official records, he was presented with the Member of the Order of the British Empire by King George VI. Standing in the presence of the British monarch, Pujol became the only person in the history of the Second World War to receive high honors from both the Allies and the Axis powers for his contributions to the same conflict. It was a surreal juxtaposition that perfectly encapsulated his life. He held the gratitude of a king and the respect of a Führer, all while being the most successful liar on the planet. However, as the war drew to a close in early 1945, the weight of his deception began to press heavily upon him. Pujol was a man who had seen the horrors of the Spanish Civil War, and he understood the vengeful nature of totalitarian regimes. Even as the Reich crumbled, the threat of the rumored werewolf partisans, die-hard Nazi insurgents, loomed in his mind. He feared that if the Germans ever realized the extent to which he had humiliated them, his life would be measured in minutes. The man who had lived behind a curtain of falsehoods for years realized that his only hope for a peaceful future was to disappear entirely. In 1949, the world received word that Juan Pujol García had died. The official story, whispered through intelligence circles and later released to the public, was that he had traveled to Angola on business and succumbed to a sudden, violent bout of malaria. A death certificate was produced, and the file on the master spy code named Garbo was seemingly closed forever. But this was merely his final, most personal operation. He had not died in the heat of Africa. Instead, he had vanished into the vast landscapes of South America. Pujol relocated to Venezuela, settling in the town of Lagunillas. He changed his name, shedding the skin of the master deceiver to become a humble shopkeeper and a manager of a small cinema. For nearly 4 decades, he lived a life of total anonymity. His neighbors saw him as a polite, unassuming man who enjoyed the quiet rhythm of the tropics. Even his own children grew up with no knowledge of their father's past. They saw a man who sold gifts and tickets, never suspecting that the quiet figure sitting at the dinner table was the primary architect of the deception that broke the back of the Nazi war machine. He lived as a ghost among the living, watching the 20th century unfold from the safety of his own shadow. The silence lasted until 1984, when the tireless work of historian Nigel West finally pierced the veil. When West tracked him down in Caracas, the revelation that Garbo was still alive sent shockwaves through the historical community. At 72 years old, the ghost returned to the world of men. He traveled back to Europe, and on the 40th anniversary of the Normandy landings, he stood upon the sands of Omaha Beach. As he looked out at the English Channel at 10 a.m. on that anniversary morning, the memories of the lies he had told to save those very shores must have been overwhelming. Veterans who had survived the slaughter of that day approached him, some with tears in their eyes, to thank the man whose imagination had cleared their path and spared countless lives. Juan Pujol García passed away in Caracas in 1988, but his legacy remains a haunting reminder of the power of the individual. He was a man who possessed no armies, no tanks, and no bombs, yet he exerted more influence over the destiny of Europe than many generals. He proved that the most effective weapon in any conflict is the truth, especially when it is dressed in the clothing of a lie. His life was a masterpiece of invisibility, a reminder that the greatest heroes are often those who never seek the light. He walked through the fires of the century's greatest conflagration without ever leaving a footprint, leaving behind only the quiet, luring peace that he had risked everything to secure. He was the spy who fooled a dictator, the ghost who walked away, and the man who proved that sometimes the only way to save the world is to make sure it never knows you were there. July 29, 1984, at 10 a.m., a man who had been officially dead for 36 years stood overlooking the vast, silent rows of white crosses at the Normandy American Cemetery. To the few tourists passing by, he was simply an elderly Spaniard with thick glasses and a contemplative expression. They had no way of knowing that they were standing in the presence of Juan Pujol García, the man the British called Garbo. He was the invisible architect of the very victory that these crosses commemorated, a man whose imagination had served as a shield for thousands of soldiers who never knew his name. As he looked out over Omaha Beach, the weight of a lifetime spent in the shadows finally seemed to settle upon his shoulders. This was the first time he had seen the ground where his lies had met the reality of war, and the silence of the cliffs was a stark contrast to the storm of deception he had conjured 4 decades earlier. The story of Juan Pujol is one of the most profound paradoxes in the history of warfare. He was a soldier who never fired a rifle, a strategist who never sat in a war room, and a hero whose greatest contribution required him to vanish from the face of the earth. At 2 p.m. on the afternoon of D-Day, while the world watched the liberation of Europe begin, Pujol was still hard at work in London, carefully maintaining the fiction that the real invasion was yet to come. He was a novelist whose audience was the high command of the Third Reich, and his stakes were the lives of an entire generation. He didn't just provide false information. He created an entire alternate reality, complete with 27 fictional sub-agents, each with their own fabricated lives, addresses, and political leanings. The brilliance of his work lay in its psychological depth. He understood that the most effective way to deceive a dictator was to feed his existing biases. Hitler and his generals expected an invasion at the Pas-de-Calais, and Pujol gave them exactly what they wanted to see. He turned the German intelligence service into his unwitting collaborators, making them so dependent on his reports that they ignored the evidence of their own eyes. It is a terrifying thought that the course of the 20th century was guided, in no small part, by the creative output of a single man in a rented room in London. He was the master of the Phantom Army, the commander of ghosts who held the German panzer divisions at bay, while the Allies established their foothold on the continent. But the cost of such a victory was the total erasure of the self. By 1948, Pujol realized that as long as Alaric, his German persona, remained a leg, Juan Pujol could never be safe. With the assistance of British intelligence, he orchestrated his own death in Angola. He stepped into a second life of obscurity in Venezuela, working as a teacher and a shopkeeper, keeping the secret even from his own family. For decades, his children believed their father was a simple man of modest means, never suspecting that he held the highest honors from both the British Empire and the German Reich. This was the ultimate sacrifice of the spy, to live a life where your greatest achievements can never be whispered, where your identity is a mask that can never be removed, and where your legacy is written in the lives of people who will never know you existed. As the sun began to set at 4 p.m. during his visit to the Normandy cliffs in 1984, Pujol was surrounded by veterans who had survived the landings. When they finally learned who he was, they didn't see a spy or a deceiver. They saw the man who had given them a chance to grow old. The legacy of Garbo is not found in the archives of MI5 or the history books of the Second World War, but in the quiet moments of peace that followed. It is found in the families of the men who didn't die on the beaches because the German reinforcements were waiting for an army that wasn't there. He proved that in the face of overwhelming darkness, the most powerful weapon is not the sword, but the mind. He was the invisible architect of the modern world, a reminder that the greatest heroes are often those who never seek the light. He walked through the fires of the century's greatest conflagration without ever leaving a footprint, leaving behind only the quiet, enduring peace that he had risked everything to secure. Juan Pujol García died in 1988, but he had already mastered the art of being a ghost long before that. He remains a testament to the fact that truth is a fragile thing, often protected by a bodyguard of lies. He was the spy who fooled a dictator, the ghost who walked away, and the man who proved that sometimes the only way to save the world is to make sure it never knows you were there.